and welcome to the Clarion Energy News Studio. Today I'm joined with James Harris, and we're going to be looking at the emerging trends in Asia. James, thanks so much for joining us today.
Thank you.
Globally, there is definitely a strong drive towards increasing renewables, we're seeing more renewables being brought onto the grid. But how do you see this disrupting or changing the traditional utility model?
That's a good question. In what we do in our day-to-day work, we tend to represent three types of clients: either government, or the developer sponsors, or the financiers to the sponsors. And so we get a really good perspective, a kind of a 360-degree perspective of what each of them do, what are the drivers for each of them, what are their requirements. And it's, I guess, a really good example in the utility space is somebody like JERA. They were presenting this morning. They've made the transition from, two separate utility companies in Japan to a new JV. I was working with them last year on their acquisition in Taiwan, Formosa One. They're a really good example of how utilities have adapted to the current trend, which is very much moving away from fossil fuel and much more towards the renewables market.
And how are project finance models adapting to the energy transition?
It's all about risk, and it's looking at risks. Project finance is all about risk and the revenue streams and looking at the integrity and maintaining that. So moving to renewables just means a slight shift away from the fossil fuel risk paradigm to a new risk paradigm, right? You no longer necessarily have coal supply is your major concern, but you still need to have issues to do with the solar panels. You still need to have issues considered in the risk context for onshore or offshore wind. So we're seeing that the project banks are starting to look at risks in these areas now and pricing those risks accordingly. At the moment, there's a real attraction to renewables, and so we'll see what happens in the coming years, but banks I've seen are very, very aggressively chasing the renewables work, which they weren't doing in the post-GFC up until maybe just a few years ago area in mainstream coal-fired, say, power.
And from a project development perspective, do you see digitalization as a disruptor or an enabler?
I think it's a bit of both. I think it's definitely a disruptor, and that's not a bad thing because it opens up lots of opportunities. I also see it as an enabler because it's forcing, in a way, it's forcing innovation in the industries, and it's also going to open up other opportunities for probably banks and other financial investors to look at structuring some of the supply of some of these digitization products, for instance. And I think that it's going to be certainly an area to watch. We've got a bunch of our focus very much on that, and I think it's going to be tied to the development in, say, electronic vehicles and all that sort of new area through artificial intelligence.
And where do you see the Asian utility model moving within the next 10 years?
Oh, 10 years. I think it will change somewhat, obviously. There'll be more movement towards gas-fired, gas to power, mainstream renewables. And I think you might start to find the model with the unbundling, rooftop solar. It's all going to have an impact which is going to be driven both by the consumer demand, by the political agenda, by what the banks are willing to do, and by, technology.
And what other areas are you most interested in outside of your core focus?
Well, outside of, I guess, the renewables space particularly, it's all the attached areas because, for instance, offshore wind in Taiwan, it's all become quite new. But in order to service that, they need to create additional markets in all the elements of the supply chain. The infrastructure needs to be upgraded, ports need to be either built or upgraded. There's a lot around the cabling that needs to be done, the domestic manufacturing, local content requirements. So it's not just about the sort of traditional elements of the asset in question, it's the sort of surrounding areas that I find interesting as well.
James, thank you so much for sharing your insights with us today. And thank you for watching. For more industry-related content, please visit the on-screen address.